Okay, welcome everyone to the Georgetown Chinese Politics and Economy Research Seminar Series. My name is Li Liu. I'm an assistant professor at the McDonald School of Business. I'm co-organizing this speaker series with Professor Ning Leng at the McCourt School of Public Policy, who's also in the audience. So this speaker series is made possible due to the generous support from the initiative for U.S.-China dialogue on global affairs and also the co-sponsorship between the initiative and the government department. So today it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Lynette H. Lynette is an associate professor of political science at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Her research theme is to understand how state interacts with non-state actors, whether it's mobilization or repression. So she's a very productive scholar, and this year alone, she has 2 books coming out. So I highly encourage you to check them out. Besides this book, she's going to present today, Outsourcing Repression. She has another book called The Street and the Ballot Box, Interactions between social movements and electoral politics in authoritarian contexts, where she studies the 2018 Malaysian election and other cases in China. Both of the books can be ordered online now, and I will post the links to the books later in the chat box, and please check them out. And before the talk, let me just go over the logistics. Lynette will be speaking about 45 minutes to 1 hour. If you have a clarification question, feel free to raise your hand and ask. But if you have a longer and more substantive question, please save it to the Q&A after the presentation. And also a very important notification from Lynette is that if anyone in the audience would like to quote and also would like to quote the talk content in the media, any quote has to be cleared with the speaker, with her, before public circulation, because it will be very helpful to sort of elaborate on the points. Okay, without further ado, let's welcome Lynette to present her recent book. Thank you. Welcome to Georgetown.
I'm very, very pleased to be presenting here, virtually to Georgetown audience. Thank you everyone for coming. So this is a book about outsourcing repression and how the state outsources repression in order to augment or to increase its everyday state power. And the case in point is China. So let me begin with a quote from reading Lolita in Tehran. The worst crime committed by totalitarian mindsets is that they force their citizens, including their victims, to become complicit in their crimes. Dancing with your jailer, participating in your own execution, that is an act of utmost brutality. So let me also begin with the puzzle of the book. The puzzle of the book is quite simply, an authoritarian state would like to coerce compliance to its everyday policies, would like to apply repression on its society. This is what states do, but especially authoritarian states would like to impose obedience on society. So that on the one hand. On the other hand, we know that there's a dictator's dilemma. States, the more you repress, the states care about repression, but they also want to be loved at the same time. So there's a little bit of dilemma there. When you repress, you're also likely to invite backlash and resistance. And how do you actually balance the two? How do you actually balance the trade-off between coercion or repression on the one hand and minimizing backlash and resistance on the other hand? So that is my starting point, my search for an answer to address the puzzle. So I use the case of urbanization as really a window of observation to allow me to address this very puzzle. And in the urbanization, which is a prevalent phenomenon in China, the rate of urbanization or the percentage of urban population in China has increased from about 25% in the 1990s to 62% last year. So it has increased by many fold in the last 3-4 decades or so. So urbanization, demolition, land grabs, and then subsequent construction, it's very common. If you have been to China, you would definitely know what I mean. So a common scene of bulldozers and in the making. So the two types of main characters in my book are, number one, the violent thugs, and number two, the non-violent brokers. So these are two types of non-state actors that the state outsources repression to in order to augment its everyday state power. But what I want to underline in this talk is the sort of repression that the Chinese state conducts, the sort of non-state brokers that it outsources repression to, are like the two figures in the book cover. They are really faceless. They are not people that you can actually identify with, not a famous person that we can actually find on some newspapers. These are average person on the street, which could be anyone from the street. So a violent thug could be someone who is out of a job, who is unemployed, who has some muscle power and willing to sell his muscle power for a project, for a profit, exchanging service for a profit, right? Could be anybody. The type of non-violent brokers are the neighborhood aunties, neighborhood volunteers, enthusiasts on the street. Again, they could be anybody, right? People that we rub shoulders if we walk around Hutong in Beijing, if we walk around alleys in Shanghai. These are faceless non-state actors that the state outsources repression to. And these are the agents. So the two types of agents are thugs for hire. Those are the violent thugs, and the non-violent brokers. So these are the agents, the two mechanisms through which they help to augment everyday state power, everyday repression, which are violent mechanism, and mobilizing the masses, which is a non-violent mechanism. So really, if you think about this, my dependent variable, to put it in more social sciencey term, my dependent variable is really everyday state power. And my independent variable are the two types of agent, thugs for hire and brokers, through two types of mechanisms: everyday repression and mobilizing the masses. Now, there are three bodies of literature that the book addresses. So this is really a book about state repression, and by examining certain type of repressive tactics, I try to illustrate how state power is being augmented. And the type of repression is also a new form of authoritarian control. So these are the two key bodies of literature that my book speaks to. And this is my empirical strategy. So I based on three major sources of data. First is ethnographic research conducted annually from 2011 to 2019. Second, I also draw on, well, I have a group of students that built an original media source event data set that contains more than 2,000 land taking and demolition cases. So these are rural land taking and urban demolition cases from the 1990s through to the late 2010s. And number three, I also draw on government policy documents. So these are regulations on land taking and housing demolition issued by the central government, issued by Shanghai, Chengdu, and Zhengzhou municipalities from 90s to the 2010s. Now I picked these three cities because I conduct the bulk of my field research in these three cities, right? As I would demonstrate more, as I would go into further detail later. So I then conduct content analysis on the policy documents. Just to give you a sense of the sort of field sites that I have been to. So starting from, so this came off my first book project, which was on, rural credit and rural political economy of development in China. After that book was done, local government started to go into urbanization, and I was curious about the whole thing. So I started field research in 2011 in Hefei. And then proceeded to Beijing, Kunming, Chengdu, Zhengzhou, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Tianjin. So if you look at the map, there are two types of indicators. The one with squares, cases that sites that I have spent enough time in that have allowed me to collect enough data to form a proper case studies in the later chapters. So these are Beijing, Zhengzhou, and Chengdu, and Kunming, and the other cities such as Guangzhou, Hefei, and Tianjin. I have spent time in, but for various reasons, I have not gotten sufficient data to form a proper case study. But I have quotations from those field research sprinkled throughout the book. So the arguments in brief. So basically, what I'm arguing is that everyday state power is really a type of quotidian exercise of state authority, everyday exercise of state authority to lead, to govern, as well as to rule society, right? And how do I operationalize state power or state strength? There are three main components. One is participation. The state must be able to marshal some societal members to become state proxies. And the first step of marshalling could be done through material or financial incentives. People could be bought. Non-state actors could be bought, could be paid to participate in state bidding, or they can do it voluntarily, right? The second component is acquiescence. So once you have mobilized a small group of people to participate in state bidding, this small group of state proxies can then go out to obtain compliance from the broader society using the specific resources, the unique resources that these non-state brokers have. And these unique resources are different for different type of brokers. So for violent thugs for hire, it is their violence or their capacity to use threat of violence to get things done. For the non-violent brokers, it could be their social capital, that the social capital and legitimacy that they command within the community that allows them to impose compliance and impose obedience on the community, right? And the third component is legitimation. So I looked at three types of brokers: political brokers, social brokers, and economic brokers. Now, social brokers, who are mostly volunteers and enthusiasts, they enjoy large degree of legitimation in their communities. And with sort of legitimation, it actually improves societal acceptance of state policies without having to resort to the use of threat or violence. So how is everyday state power being practiced? So this diagram is divided into 3 layers. First layer is how does outsourcing repression works. So the state will go out there and marshal a small group of society to become proxies. So these are violent thugs for hire and non-violent brokers. And then these state proxies will then repress or mobilize the society. And the target is the larger society. So you have participation for the first group of people and acquiescence of the larger society in the second set. Now, acquiescence has a much higher threshold than participation, because acquiescence is of the larger society is much more difficult to obtain their compliance compared to this smaller group. And the scope condition here is really proximity of proxies, and I would explain that in a minute. So complicity, they could do it either they could be bought or they could be doing it voluntarily, right? So two subset of complicity. One is if someone participates willingly participate. So if the state pays the military, pays the police, pays the thugs for hire to do a certain job, to conduct protest policing, to arrest protesters, for instance. Now, the strength of this witting participation is then a function of state strength over the proxies. In other words, the nature of the principal-agent relationship. So you think about it as, you know, a person with a leash. How tight is the leash of the principal over the agent? That determines the strength of the witting participation. The other components unwitting participation is when the proxies hold the normative belief that they are actually contributing to the public good by doing the state's bidding. The state don't even need to pay them on most occasions. So these people do it out of ideological convictions, cultural myths, trust in government, and due to propaganda, information control. And this is what this is a similar concept to what Margaret Levy means by, you know, value-based type of legitimacy. So let's take a closer look at everyday repression and thugs for hire. This is based on I've got 2 chapters devoted to violent strategies, and they're largely drawn from my earlier work published about five years ago in 2018. So thugs for hire are, you know, ruffians, hooligans, hoodlums, street gangsters, or sometimes legalized professionals, meaning private security, who render violence for a for-profit service. Again, these are faceless thugs, faceless gangsters that could be anyone on the street. And thugs for hire usually comprise of the unemployed, those lacking regular salary jobs, or people who simply want to, you know, who make trouble in order to earn a living, right? They are distinct, very distinct from the existing literature on violent agents. The existing literature talk about Italian mafias by Gambetta, right? Hill talks about, you know, Japanese yakuza. Volkov talks about, you know, Russian violent entrepreneurs. Those are all terribly interesting, and I see my work having parallels with these interesting body of literature. But it's also very distinct in the sense that, unlike these people, they are not highly trained at all. What they have is muscle power. They don't even have the sophisticated weapon. They don't belong to kind of sophisticated, complex, organized group that mafias or yakuzas do, right? And in terms of, you know, capacity for violence and the public and private nature of their force, if I could put this in context of people who study violent agents in general. So these include the military, paramilitary, the police, the militias, vigilantes, the mafias. And if you see them as divided into 2 axes, you have capacity for violence. Thugs for hire sits at the very bottom, very low capacity for violence. So they use threat of violence, intimidation, sometimes carry out violence, but most of the time it's just threat of violence. And it's a private use of force. So it's definitely illegal and illegitimate. Whereas those public force like military, police, and to some extent paramilitary, they are officially paid and endorsed by the state. So they are also, this is how I have conceptualized thugs for hire among other violent agents. So what are the benefits of everyday repression via thugs for hire? Well, these thugs for hire, they are perpetrators of illegal or illegitimate act. So in China, local governments have a lot of unfunded mandates, and we know that from studies which are like 20 years old, such as from Bernstein and we published in about 2000. because of the decentralized nature of the system, at the bottom level, local governments have a lot of mandates, but they are not given enough sufficient funding for. So they want to get things done, but they don't have legitimacy to do it. And some of the actions are actually illegal and illegitimate. They cannot go out and send a police officer to go and do it. So what they do is they hire, thugs to do that sort of dirty jobs. In addition, the non-state identity of these thugs then offers a pretense of plausible deniability, right? In case they beat up someone and someone got injured or someone get killed, because this is a person without a face, without a uniform, it offers a pretense of plausible deniability. Local governments can turn around and say that I don't know, this person has got nothing to do with me. And most of the time they are able to get away with it. So I've got two chapters. One contrasts everyday sort of repression that the state is actually able to get away with it. I have another chapter that draws on very detailed case studies that I've actually visited those sites where officials have gotten into trouble because they hire thugs, and thugs have used undisciplined violence. Right, so in this case, you have agency problem. You're not able to control your agents very well. Principal, the local governments being the principal, they cannot control the thugs as agent, and it results in accountability problem. Worse still, some local officials have been fired because of death resulting from violence from demolition and land grabs. In other places, the problem of thugs for hire has gotten so serious that these people have become wealthy. They monopolize all sorts of resources within the village, let's say, to the extent that village authorities, actually its state authority, the power has been usurped to a large extent by these thugs and gangsters, which which really led to, I think, Xi Jinping's political campaign of sweeping black, who are trying to get rid of the gangsters in rural society, particularly. I will elaborate on that a little bit later. Now, let me talk about the sort of the nature of actions that thugs for hire are involved in. So if we see a repressive act as one in between, what is observable and unobservable, right? So that is one criterion. The other criterion is whether they are state agents or non-state agents. So you have state agents conducting observable repression, such as police arrest. State agents conducting unobservable repression, such as phone tapping by intelligence agent. You have non-state agents such as thugs for hire beating up civilians in broad daylight. That's observable. Non-state agents such as thugs for hire kidnapping victims in dark alleys. That's non-observable. Now, the everyday repression that I refer to is actually the bottom right-hand quadrant here. It is conducted by non-state agent, is largely unobservable because it's conducted late at night, away from the public's eyes. Sometimes they were so emboldened that, or they were so desperate that they go and beat up people in broad daylight. That is when they usually get into trouble, because people can come in and use a mobile phone and take a snapshot and record a video and then upload to Weibo, and it becomes viral, right? But that is actually not the sort of everyday repression that I am referring to. So that's basically the first half of the book. The second half is about nonviolent strategies. So this is, if you think about it, the state wants to mobilize the society, but it faces huge costs in mobilizing each and every single member of society. So what is the solution here? So because of the cost of mobilizing every member of society, a state needs brokers to connect it with the masses, right? So this should conjures up an image of, think about an octopus with its many tentacles that is able to extend into society and grip society, like how it ensnares its prey. And what are the tentacles? The tentacles are three types of brokers that I have conceptualized. One is political brokers, social brokers, and economic brokers. So these political brokers are urban communities, 社区, rural village committees, urban neighborhood committees, the 居委会. Their power comes from state authority, right? Because they are semi-state official, they are appointed by the state. And then you have the social brokers who are community volunteers and enthusiasts, right? These are totally non-state, has no state affiliation whatsoever. Their power comes from social capital they actually command in the society. Now, these are long-term residents in the community. They know everyone intimately well. They know about people's condition and is able to help the state, providing information to the state and help the state mobilize the society. The third type of brokers is economic brokers. These are profit-seeking intermediaries. Just these people only want to make money out of China's urbanization projects, right? And their power comes from their capacity really to reduce information asymmetry between the state and the society, and be able to meet supply, to match supply and demand. Because often the society, people with grievances want compensation that is this much, but the state is only willing to give this much. So these people would then go out to the street and stage a protest because in order to get more compensation. So this create a demand for these economic brokers to come in and bring these two people together and reduce their information gap and then match supply and demand. And economic brokers is also based on a paper that I published about 4 years ago. So, this book speaks to three major bodies of literature: state power, repression, and authoritarian control. And I see the major theoretical contribution as, if you start from state power, this is about the state augments its power through complicit proxies, complicit societal members. In terms of repression, this is about using everyday repression and thugs for hire as a stick. But because this is a stick that is wielded by a third party, it helps to reduce the cost of coercion. It is also a form of authoritarian control, and in a sense, a new tool in the autocrat's toolkit. If we think about the typical autocrat's toolkit consists of carrots. You can give welfare, such as what Jennifer Pan's book published 2 years ago talks about the state doling out of welfare provision to people to buy stability. You can give people carrots or you can give them sticks, punishment. There are a ton of literature on sticks as a form of authoritarian control. And I think my contribution here is when I talk about social brokers, when they conduct persuasion, which is underpinned by legitimacy, it actually helps to acquire compliance without resorting to sticks. So in a way, it's a new tool in the autocrat's toolkit. So let me spend some time talking about one of the sources of data that I have, which is an events data set sourced from multiple sources of media. And I classify agents into very different types. So these are coercive agents. They are the security police, such as the state security, such as the police, the 警察 or the 公安, Quasi-security police, these are the street patrols, assistant police, or joint law enforcement teams. Or they are the government officials, who are the urban street officials, rural township officials, officials from Ban, from demolition or expropriation officers. So these are government officials. And the next layer down is grassroots government officials. These are village committees, urban communities, and neighborhood communities. In other words, these are political brokers, right? And the next layer down are grassroots government, non-government officials who are volunteers and activists, who are social brokers. And then you have the thugs, who are examples are, private companies hired by, include, demolition companies, developers. Instances are such as unidentified agents, hooligans, gangsters, so on and so forth. So, I search keywords in these cases and then quote my cases accordingly. These are the number of times that violent agents have actually appeared in each cases. So government officials appeared most frequently, right? And these government officials are not necessarily violent; they are actually non-violent. And then you have state security being the second most common being deployed. Third, commonly deployed are thugs, followed by grassroots government, grassroots non-government, and quasi-state security. So you can see that thugs are actually very prevalent in urbanization projects. This is a heat map of the cross tabulation. So on the one hand, you have different agent types, from private to the state, and a different type of violence strategies, ranging from the most common, the default strategy of disruption, which means you cut off people's electricity supply, water supply. That's almost the default strategy that these agents resort to. And then you injure people, you beat up people, you kill people, you arrest them, you restrict their liberties, or some sort of covert act, such as government officials will invite two families out for dinner, and in the meantime they send in the bulldozers and bulldoze their homes. There are strange things like that happening in rural China. As you can see, the thugs are most commonly being deployed in killing, injuring people, acts that injure people, disruption, but also quite common in terms of restricting liberties is mostly the work of state security, right? And these are the marginal effects of agent types on non-violent citizen responses. So the dependent variable are, when certain type of agents is being sent, what sort of response citizens will come up with. And the non-violent responses are protest, petition, and legal mobilization. So if you look at protests, when thugs are sent, the marginal likelihood of that provoking protest is actually negative compared to state security, which is very large. And same thing applies to petition and legal mobilization. And even legal mobilization, where it's slightly positive for thugs, is still far less compared to government officials being sent to do that sort of job. This is marginal effects of agent types on violent citizen responses. So the violent citizen responses are the default ones of damaging properties, self-harm. So sometimes citizens, when they face violent demolition of their homes, they get so emotional that they damage their own properties, or they use a knife and commit suicide. There are actually a lot of cases like that. Or they get so angry that they use a knife and trying to stab demolition agents. Now, I looked at when different agent types are deployed. Harming agent for thugs is relatively less compared to security agent. Thugs for self-harm is actually negative compared to quasi-security and government officials. So if you see this as kind of everyday repression via thugs for hire, I think these evidence suggests that the cost of hiring thugs for hire is actually very low. The cost meaning cost in terms of resistance and backlash. The cost of provoking citizen responses, be it violent or non-violent, is actually very low compared to sending state security, such as the police, compared to sending government officials to do same type of act, right? So that's average everyday repression. Now, I also look at those exception cases because those exception cases are actually very important and can be very illuminating. So let me tell you a little bit about how I select my cases. And you can almost think about it as what people would call a selection bias, because I read on the paper saying that there's a 群体性事件 in this city. There's a major mass incident in the city because of violent demolition. This happened a couple of years ago, and I went to take a look, right? And a series of things happened after that. Usually it's about local officials losing their position. They are being sacked, and the government get into trouble. Local government get into trouble. They get punished for violence use. And those are actually, so these type of thick case studies in my book are actually failed cases of everyday repression. I've got 3 cases. One is about arson and violent demolition in the former French concession in Shanghai. This is in 2005. So the case took place in 2005, but my visit was a couple of years ago. Case number 2 was a violent land grab and housing demolition in a village in Kunming in 2011. Case number 3 is massive demolition and violent land grabs in Zhengzhou in mid-2010s. So in these cases, I illustrate that when you have agency problem, when the agent, that is the thugs for hire, they use undisciplined violence or excessive violence over and above what is actually needed to get the job done, it actually denies the benefit of plausible deniability or evasion of accountability, and end up getting local officials into trouble, right? And worse still, in some cases, especially I illustrate that in the case of Kunming, outsourcing violence end up usurping state capacity. State has to really decentralize a lot of power, delegate a lot of authorities to these thugs to do a bunch of things which state usually does. And that eats into state legitimacy, which is why several years later, Xi Jinping then launched the 扫黑除恶, the sweeping black campaign. If you look at this, to give you a sense of the case studies, the 3 case studies, Shanghai, Kunming, Zhengzhou, and Beijing, they took place in various times from mid-2000s to 2010. My field research was conducted from 2012 to 2018. So let me move on. So I want to leave plenty of time for discussion. So I'll take up another 10 minutes or so. Let me talk about, use the remaining of my time to talk about state-society relationship that is brokered by non-state brokers. So if you see the state, right, the bottom layer of the state consisting of street level officers in urban areas and township in rural areas, and you have society. There's actually a middle layer of brokers in between, which I think, a lot of people, scholars take for granted. To me, they are brokers. They are not actually state agents because they have agency of their own. In terms of urban areas, you can think about them as political brokers. They are the Seshi, the residence committee, residence small group, the block captains, social brokers such as volunteers and village enthusiasts. Rural areas, you have the village committees, the village small groups, and production teams. And you have social brokers too in rural areas. You also have the economic brokers. These are people go out there purely to seek profit. And political brokers, social brokers, and economic brokers, they help to connect state and society. Schematically, this is how they actually differ, the three of them. Now, political brokers, they are the village committees and residence committees, is a top-down approach. They take order from the state and they pass the order down to the citizens, and their power largely come from their semi-state authority, right? But you have the social brokers. The way that they mobilize people is not one of top-down approach, but one of mobilizing the society. So these are volunteers and enthusiasts, which they then go out and mobilize society using their social capital. Economic brokers, they are the in-between state seller and citizen buyers. They help to broker or the supply and help to match supply and demand between the two set of actors. The functions include collection of information, intimate and personal information. So in the book, I go into a lot of detail about the sort of information. So this is not just about when a government wants to demolish this community, they need to know, they need to enter this household and collect all sorts of information. And this is not only about counting the number of hits. When the Chinese say 数人头, this goes beyond that. This is about understanding people's personality, understanding their financial situation, how many sons and daughters do they have, and at what age are they, because that would actually give you a clue of how likely or not they are going to accept government's offers. And government's offers could be, could mean cash payment, it could mean giving people apartments. And people's different conditions, unique conditions would help to determine that. Brokers are also mobilizing vehicle for the state. They also help to manufacture conflicts in order to gain from that conflict. They also help to mediate conflicts as well as to resolve conflicts. But also, rather importantly, social brokers, they are also legitimating vehicles for state actions. So this is a heat map of nonviolent strategies and agents. These are the agents, government officials, grassroots government officials, grassroots non-government officials, the thugs, the real estate developers. The sort of non-violent strategies are collective punishment, right? Welfare suspension, thought work, 思想工作, financial rewards. So these are data collected from media sources. Now, I should say that there is, of course, a gross underestimation of actual cases, because, thought work is something I think so endemic within Chinese society that people don't report. All right, people don't report. People don't think about it as a repressive strategies. So there's a qualification to what I'm saying. So there's a gross underestimation, but given that, you could see government officials most commonly involved in collective punishment and welfare suspensions, because they have the power to suspend welfare. They have the power to do all sorts of punishment. Whereas the thugs are highly not involved in these non-violent repression at all. Whereas the grassroots non-government officials, which are the volunteers and enthusiasts, they are involved in thought work and they are involved in welfare suspension. Okay, this is based on strategies and then whether or not they result in resistance or compliance. So compliance is registered when no resistance is observed. Resistance include, an aggregate of categories. If people go out to protest, legal mobilizations, refuse to relocate, calling the police, harming agent, petition, publicizing on social media, those I would classify and lump them together as resistance. If the case gets resolved without registering any of these resistance, I take this as compliance. So you can see the collective punishment, 87% of the time resulting in resistance, which is not surprising at all. Welfare punishment, almost 100% of the time. Thought work, very interestingly, but not that surprisingly, almost 80% resulting in compliance. Financial rewards also resulting in compliance. So really, these are all nonviolent strategies, but the book focuses on thought work, as a form of brokered persuasion. So then another chapter I looked at, thick case study evidence to illustrate how brokers in harmonious demolition works. Draws on 3 major cases. One is self-governance renovation, 自改委 in Chengdu. These are committees set up to take over the responsibility of demolition from the state. So they have to organize themselves and convince people who are not willing to agree to demolition to agree, right? And they use all sorts of strategies. And the committee usually consists of political brokers and social brokers who could go and do the job of persuading people who are not willing to comply. And I also examined 2 failed 自改委 cases, basically to illustrate that if legitimacy is lacking, then brokerage wouldn't work. So legitimacy of these brokers are actually the glue that holds the whole thing together. And I also looked at mediation case studies, people's mediation that draws on persuasion and grammar of human compassion to persuade family members to agree to things that they wouldn't agree to. And they are persuaded to put collective interest, that of the family or that of the community, above that of themselves. I looked at Huangniu, which is a type of economic brokers. These are professional profit-seeking brokers, how they helped to match supply and demand and facilitate bargaining between state and society. And this is based on case studies in Shanghai. So I have talked about violent strategies, violent agents. I've talked about non-violent strategies, non-violent agents. Now, let me give you a sense of the temporal distribution of these strategies. So this graph is from my 3rd source of data, which is content analysis of government regulation and or policy documents. So policy documents mention a bunch of rewards, punishment, and persuasion over time. You can see that the significance of persuasion has actually increased over time, right? This the darkest bar. But that of punishment has actually declined over time. And rewards have stayed more or less constant, right? And this gives you a sense of the temporal distribution of preemptive versus ex post measure. Preemptive measures such as persuasion, thought work, before they go out to protest and become social conflicts, the state trying to preempt that sort of conflicts. Ex post is when they dole out punishment, dole out sticks. You can see that preemptive strategies has also increased over time, which has become more prominent over time, whereas ex post strategy has also declined since 2011. This is when a major law being passed, a regulation that passed that regulates how violent demolition is being conducted. And after 2011, there's actually very little ex post measures being used. So basically, so I think my book shows evidence of the temporal variation of violent and non-violent strategies. It also shows the spatial variation of violent and non-violent strategies. So if I could go back here. So if you look at, from west to east, so I started from Hefei, then I went from Chengdu, Zhengzhou, Kunming, which are all violent cases happened. And I moved from the coastal cities over time, over a decade. As time moved on, I have realized that, all the violent strategies are gradually giving way to non-violent strategies. in the name of achieving a harmonious society or harmonious demolition, 和谐拆迁. And it's not only from rural to urban, right? It's also from city outskirts, city peripheries, which are very violent, usually very violent, to inner core of the cities. Demolition in CBDs, in central business districts, very, very rarely would involve violence in the last 10, 15 years. Okay, let me sum it up. In chapter 7, I have 2 comparative cases, South Korea and India, which to me are terribly interesting, but they offer the most similar case. South Korea, during its authoritarian period, was very, very similar to China in the last 30 years. But post-authoritarian period, during democracy, surprisingly, violent demolition actually did not stop. And I think that offers lessons for what China would look like in years to come. I'm not saying that China is going to democratize, but as the cost of using violence getting more and more expensive, this is how it will resemble. It will resemble Korea of today. India is very different. So it offers the most dissimilar case, and I go into gundas and all sorts of interesting, well, at least to me, interesting use of violence to clear urban slums in Mumbai. In the conclusion, I talked about generalizing outsourcing repression beyond urbanization. I talk about generalizing my arguments beyond China. I talk about implications for Xi Jinping's sweeping back campaign, the motivation, I think, of this campaign and why he thinks that is so important, and what that means to the implications for China's political future. I also offer some personal thoughts on the future of field research in China. You know, since I spent so much time on this book, and things have changed so, I think, so drastically, as many of us could relate to in the last couple of years in China, is questionable. You know, the type of research that we could do in China has also fundamentally changed. And I'll end with this picture, which I took several years ago at a 4-star hotel in Shanghai. I spotted an electronic signboard that promotes sweeping black campaign in a quite a luxury class hotel in Shanghai. So I'll leave it here, and thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to your comments.
Thanks everyone for coming to our talk. So we're going to have another talk next week, talking about the US-China trade war and also deglobalization. All right, thank you so much, Lynette, for being here, and that is such a fantastic talk.